Hello, good afternoon. This is the first of our events in the fall season for the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. There will be a symposium on colonialism, imperialism, and famines at the end of October, and the annual famine lecture will be on November the 11th, and Sahih Floki is the speaker. So I urge you, if you're interested in those events, to register, but only to register if you're really going to come, because otherwise you take someone else's place who would like to come. So we always welcome you to register, but yes?
You know, I registered and I received notification 2 days ago, a reminder.
This is very good, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what I would like to advocate that they haven't come around to do it is that everyone would have to confirm the week before, because I think really this would be progress, since we often have high registrations and then for various reasons people do it early and can or cannot come. But we welcome you at those events, and particularly welcome you this afternoon. My name is Frank Sisson. I'm on the executive committee of what we usually call REC, the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium. This is a project from the Temirtay Foundation, funded by the Temirtay Foundation at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, that deals both with research on the Holodomor or famine in Ukraine, as well as curriculum and education. And our research component has put out a number of publications since the project began in 2013. The first of these was the Holodomor Reader, which is a compendium of material, documents, scholarly articles, literature on the famine in Ukraine. And for those of us who work on the Holodomor, this is in many ways an event that by 2013-14, you could really choose these various genres. That is, the literature had grown, the scholarly works had grown, the documents were more numerous. And I'll be passing that around. The first of our conferences that we held was called Contextualizing the Holodomor, the Impact of 30 Years of Ukrainian Famine Research. And that has come out in a small booklet, but by a number of very prominent scholars. It was just reviewed by Andrew Wilson in the Slavonic and East European Review, calling this basically a basic primer and text for anyone who wants to know about the state of studying of the Ukrainian Holodomor. And it is as well, it's available in printed form, but it's also available on our journal. And I have passed out flyers on what has just came out hot off the press, published in the way things are published today online. And that is in the last week it has been put up as an issue of our Institute's journal, East-West. It's a thematic issue, and it is the second of our conferences. And this conference was Communism and Hunger, the Ukrainian, Chinese, Kazakh, and Soviet famines in comparative perspective. It was a very successful event in attendance, and particularly showed the possibility of comparative discussion with our colleagues in East Asian and Central Asian studies. And you can register for our journal. It's a free online journal, and read these. And it'll also be coming out in printed form. Today, we have the opportunity, and for those who didn't get this, okay, we will pass more, of welcoming our guest, Dr. Olga Volovina, a demographer who will be, yes, okay, someone wants the flyer, speaking to us on the language of statistics and demography on the Holodomor. And just maybe a few comments for those of you who don't are less conversant with the study of the Holodomor and our material on it. The issue of how many died has been long a major issue, much debated. As late as 1986, an attaché of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, when confronted with Robert Conquest's book, said that, well, yes, maybe there had been deaths that some kulaks, or rich peasants, had killed collective farm members. That is, the Soviet Union in no way recognized that there had been a major famine and millions of deaths. That's 1986, that long after the event had occurred. So you went from the Soviet assertion that virtually no one had died of a famine to the various attempts by those outside the Soviet Union to estimate numbers. And as early as 1933, 34, 35, groups outside of the Soviet Union were trying to deal with possible numbers, of course on the fragmentary evidence that they could gather. And numbers at that point as high as 6 and 7 million were given out by estimates. These were estimates based on fragmentary evidence. And of course, down to the fall of the Soviet Union, we had no access to the documentation that the Soviet authorities had kept. And this meant that in the 1980s, when Robert Conquest's book appeared, with the estimate of 5 million people dying in Ukraine of famine, many reacted in the West that this was much too high a figure. It was a period when there was a beginning of study of Soviet demography, groups doing it, and they saw this really as possibly much inflated. Others saw this figure as not inflated at all, and debates once again occurred on it. We are now 25 years after, 30 years after these events, and fortunately, we have had a number of demographers, in which Dr. Wolovina is one of the most prominent, who have intensively studied, trying to give us some idea of the number of victims. Dr. Wolovina was born in Lviv, Ukraine, and grew up in Argentina. He studied mathematics at the National University of Buenos Aires. He has a master's in sociology and statistics from the University of Florida, and he has a PhD in demography from Brown University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has taught at the universities of Western Ontario in Canada and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has worked as a senior policy analyst at the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina. Dr. Wolovina is a research fellow at the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a full member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US, and the founding director of the Center for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research of Ukrainians in the US at the Shevchenko Society in the US. He is currently completing his second Fulbright research grant in Ukraine, doing research on the Holodomor at the Institute of Demography and Social Studies of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He has been coordinating work on the demography of the Holodomor with a team of demographers at the Institute of Demography. His publications on the Holodomor are numerous, and he has worked intensively with colleagues in Ukraine on these publications. Dr. Wolovina.
Thank you very much, Professor Sisson. It's a great pleasure to be back in Toronto. I have fond memories from Toronto when I was a student in the United States. I spent the summer working here as an illegal student. Had a great time. As pointed out, this is a joint project with colleagues in Ukraine. We started working about 3.5 years ago when I was at Institute of Demography, and I saw that they had collected tremendous amount of data and archived documents about the Holodomor that were not researched adequately. And there were people there with a tremendous experience in the demographic history of Ukraine in the 20th century. So I saw an opportunity to start the project. We have been working for a good 3 years. We have produced a fair amount of material, but we are publishing that gradually in different journals and books. And I decided it was time to try to step back and evaluate what we have done, put it together, and what does it mean. This is the first attempt to do this synthesis type of thing, and I rely on some of the experts in the audience to help us with some of the questions our research has posed. So, where are we now? As Dr. Sisson said, we are approaching the 85th anniversary of the Holodomor. Archives have been started opening 25 years ago. We have made a lot of progress in that time period. We have a tremendous amount of work publications. Somebody said 20,000 or more of different kind. We have the Holodomor Monument and Museum in Kyiv. Until that time, from my experience, the Holodomor was not talked about very much in Ukraine, but now people know about it. This psychological backlog has been broken. Quite a few countries have recognized Holodomor as a genocide, but there's still great deal we don't know about the Holodomor, as we shall see. And some of the things we think we know turn out to be not quite correct. And I think in order to achieve our goal for the Holodomor to be widely recognized as genocide, maybe it's necessary to rethink our tactics. So the purpose of my talk is try to provide evidence supporting these three statements. So I will first go through a list of 8 facts that we assumed that were facts about the Holodomor that turned out to be not quite correct according to our research. Then I will discuss results from our estimation of Holodomor losses at the Oblast level in Ukraine. And then we just finished estimating famine losses in Russia for 23 regions in Russia, and that's the first time this has been done. And it's very important to make a comparison. What was the effect of the famine in Russia? What was the effect in Ukraine? And finally, a few thoughts about future research. So the first number is what Dr. Sisson mentioned, this controversy about number of losses. The most kind of a circulated figure, at least in the Ukrainian diaspora, is about 7 million. Now, first of all, there are 2 types of estimates, subjective and data-based. During the Holodomor, there were journalists, there were politicians, diplomats that made some guesses about how many people died of starvation in Ukraine. But these were just guesses. They didn't have the opportunity to literally count or estimate precisely what was the number of losses. So these should be taken as guesses. Then we have estimates based on data. As mentioned, archives have been closed for many, many years, so the data necessary to do a good job in the estimation were not accessible until in the late 1980s, the archives started opening, and so researchers had the opportunity to get the data needed to provide some estimates. And I think this is very important, that estimates were basically done by historians and demographers. And no offense to historians, as you will see, the estimation of losses is a very complicated task that requires certain expertise. This is a demographic problem. Now, many historians have made valiant efforts to try to estimate losses using different approaches, limited data, but they didn't have the adequate technical preparation to do a really thorough job if you have all the necessary data to do the task. So the data that is needed to do this are, first of all, censuses, 1926, 37, and 39, registration of birth and death, migration data, and if you do estimation by rural-urban, you need reclassification of areas from rural to urban or vice versa. Now, it has been established by outside experts that the 1926 and the 1937 censuses were done fairly correctly. They had minor problems, but basically the figures are sound. The problem was the 39 census. We will look into that a bit later. Now, if you want to count anything, you need a definition to know if a certain element belongs to that class or not. If you don't have a definition, we cannot have a rational discussion about how many losses we have. And that's part of the problem, that people use different definitions. So we need to establish the time period, the geography, and the cause of death. Holodomor means death by starvation. So the cause of death would be starvation by definition. Now, the data on cause of death is very unreliable even today in the most developed countries because it requires an expert to certify what is the cause of death of a person, and that's a very complicated thing. And given the situation of data in Ukraine at that time, it's practically hopeless to use that precise definition that this death was caused by starvation. So we need to have a practical solution, and the definition we are using of so-called direct losses or excess death is the number of deaths on top of what would be expected normal death had there been no famine. And we also talk about indirect deaths, and that is the birth that did not occur because of the famine. And in our definition, we use the period 1932-34. We established that in 34 were also deaths caused by starvation. And we limit the estimation to Soviet Ukraine at that time, the borders of Soviet Ukraine. Now, here are some examples of previous estimates done by historians and some economist statisticians. And we see at different time periods, we have different years, we have different estimates, and also for different periods. For example, Sosnoveitch, the period is 2000, from 1932 to 38, not 32 to 34, because at that time, his estimation was done in the late 30s. He didn't have access to all the data, so we had to use census data to do approximations. So anyhow, a very important point we'll talk about is migration. Now here we have a range between 2 million low value from Kubijovich to 5 million for conquest. So that was the range based on data estimates from different historians. Then we have estimates by demographers, and we also have different demographers from Ukrainians to Russians to French that work on this problem. And here the range goes between 2.6 million minimum to 5.8 million. So we have a range there. And you see in some cases they estimated migration, in some cases did not estimate migration because they didn't have the data. In some cases the estimation was also not only for the total population but also by age and sex. So just to make a comment, people that argue for the 7 million, number one, they ignore all this work to be done before. And the implication is that all these experts are wrong. The figure of 7 million for some reason is the one that is correct, but we will not get into that controversy. Basically, there were several ways people used to estimate losses. One was inter-census comparison. They looked at the 26 census, they looked at the 37 or 39 census, took the difference and basically said the difference is mostly due to the Holodomor. I'm simplifying. Another strategy was they extrapolated previous trends of mortality or population growth and extended that to the Holodomor period, and that they gave them the base of what the normal population should be and compared that with the census in 37, for example, and said the difference basically is attributed to the Holodomor. And also in some cases, people that argued that the Holodomor basically Stalin targeted Ukrainians specifically. They looked at how many Ukrainians there were in 26, how many in 37. There was a big difference. See, Stalin killed all these Ukrainians. These are very simplistic approaches. In some cases because of lack of all necessary data, in some cases because the lack of the necessary demographic techniques to do a better job. The correct approach is to reconstruct the actual population during that time period. What would be the mortality in 32, 33, 34? And what would the fertility, what would be the migration? And so then you will have what would be the actual mortality in those years. And then you estimate the base, what would be the normal mortality, had there no famine, and the difference will give you the number of Holodomor losses. That's the correct logic that should be used. Now, just to point examples of some of the problems, as you see, by taking census comparison 27-37, you go beyond the time period 32-34. So that already does not fit the definition we're using. In terms of extrapolating trends of mortality and fertility, this is the crude birth rate in Ukraine from 27 to 38. You see a big jump starting 36, 37, 38. Why is that? We had the 37-38 terror years where Stalin specifically targeted people in Ukraine and in some part in Russia as well, where 140,000 plus were killed, but they were not registered officially. So when we did our estimation, we added those deaths to our estimations. And so if you extrapolate the trend and ignore that, you will have an incorrect trend because you're missing that jump in those 2 years. Another problem is with trend with fertility. Something little known, there was a very high incidence of abortion in Ukraine in those years. Even in rural areas, in 1934, you had 545 abortions per 1,000 births. So given the fact that the fertility was declining, and when Stalin saw the impact of the famine on the population growth, there was a decree in June 27 that abolished abortions. So immediately fertility jumped up because all these abortions now were births. So again, if you ignore these facts, you extrapolate fertility trends, you will have this problem. This has not been taken into account. Now, the fact of migration is very important. I want to illustrate this. Let's say we have 25,000 in the year 26 and 23,000 in the year 37, difference is 2,000. So in order to get from 25 to 2,000, let's say there were 5,000 births during that time and 3,000 deaths, so the difference is 2,000. But we have zero migration. If there was migration, let's suppose there was a net migration of minus 1,000. So that 1,000 more people left that came in. Now, if we assume that the birth stayed more or less the same, we have to adjust number of deaths to 2,000 to get the difference of 2,000. If there was a positive migration of 1,000, then the number of deaths has to be adjusted so that we get a 2,000 difference, so that migration and death losses are a zero-sum game. In other words, if you ignore migration, if you had negative migration, you will underestimate mortality. If you have positive migration, you will overestimate mortality. So now migration is the most difficult component to measure. So if you don't take care to try to measure migration as well as you can, you will have a bias in the estimation of losses. That's something that many people did not do or could not do because they didn't have the data. So we first look at all the data, evaluate the quality of the data. If it was necessary, we made adjustments to the data, and then we applied the reconstruction methodology. Now, there's a very simple mathematical equation in migration. The population at one point in time is equal to the population the year before that, let's say, plus the number of births, minus the number of deaths, plus the number of net migrants, if you have urban estimation, the reclassification. So we take as pillars the census in 27. we have data on the urban population of 31, census of 37, and census of 39. As we can see, we have fairly good estimation of birth and death on the yearly basis until the year of 31, before the crisis hit. So we can add the number of births and deaths on the yearly basis, and we have to estimate migration. And if we do this process year by year, we have to match the population we have in 37. If the population doesn't match, something is wrong in between. Now, we know that there was a tremendous amount of under-registration of death in 33, and to some degree in 32 and 34. So that if we have this control, we have the deficit in death, we have to give us a margin how to estimate the level of under-registration of death in those years. But the fact is that we have this solid pillar, and we have this solid pillar, and we have this mathematical relationship, so that if you have good estimation of these components during the years, the critical years 32, 34, 3, and 34 give us the hole that we need to fill in to estimate the deaths that were missed by the registration system. Then we need to estimate the so-called normal population, where we're using different techniques. We estimate what should be the actual number of births and deaths had there been no famine, and what the actual migration had there been no famine. Having that, then we take the difference of the death, actual death and normal death, and that gives us the estimation of the losses. And we can do estimation for the total population, or also by age and sex, which is much more complicated. We'll talk about the total estimation today. So, having done all this work, these are our results that we feel fairly competent, that are the best possible results that we can achieve given all the information we have. We have a total of almost 4 million losses for the period 32-34. The bulk of them is in 33, about 90%. And we also have losses in urban areas, not only in rural areas. Much lower, about 300,000, but still a fairly significant number. So these are the basic parameters. Now, if we want to make a comparison, we have to standardize by population size. So if we divide each of these by population, in this case by 100, so we can look at this as a percentage, approximately. So for all of Ukraine, about 13% of the total population in 1933 was starved to death. In rural areas was 16%, and in urban areas about 4%. And we have estimates for 32 and 34. This is an important point, that when we are talking about the losses, this is on top of normal mortality. In other words, like in total normal mortality, so this is what would be normal mortality. This is the excess caused by the Holodomor. This is 1933. You can see the tremendous difference between the normal mortality and the death caused by starvation. And then 34. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now we come to the second point. It's impossible to estimate precisely Holodomor losses because the data was incomplete and unreliable. Well, we are going to challenge that. In Ukraine, we have the complete time series of number of births and deaths yearly between 27 and 38. So we have complete data. And if we look at death by age and birth by age of mother, only the 1932 is missing. But if we do calculation of total losses without age by sex. We have complete information by registration, birth, and death. In Russia, the same goes for birth and death, and but we have a problem that does not occur in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the registration system covered the whole territory, 100%, in the whole country. In Russia, in some regions, the registration system did not capture the whole territory. In some regions, only 21% of the total territory was captured by the registration, and the others were missed. They were not part of the system yet. The system was expanding gradually, so that when we do estimation for Russia, we have to take into account that in some regions we don't have 100% of registration. We have to make up for the difference to get an idea about the total number of deaths and births occurred in that territory. The issue is reliability. How good are the data? Well, if this is registered number of deaths on a yearly basis for Ukraine, and this is adjusted number of deaths. As people know, every registration system has some under registration. Even today in Canada, the number of death and birth is not 100%. Some people get lost in the system. So demographers evaluate the data and estimate what is the under registration and make an adjustment. It so happens that Ukraine had one of the best set of demographers in all of Europe at that time, and they did a lot of work analyzing the quality of this data. We have all the research work. So they estimated what was the undercount of deaths in this case, and until 31 it was around 10%. In 32 jumps to 19. In 1933, according to our calculations, was an under registration by 122%. Why? It was not political. When you had such a tremendous amount of death occurring every day, the system could not cope with it. In other words, bodies were piling up. Physically, it was impossible to register. We have archived documents. In many cases, the regional offices run out of forms to register deaths. They had to use normal paper. People died on the street in the cities, peasants. They were never registered. So basically, it was because of the volume of deaths and the chaos in the system that is responsible for this under registration during that year. And as you can see, in 37 and 24, the under registration jumps to 23-24% because those 140,000 people that were shot by Stalin were not registered in the system. So this another indication that you have to be careful when you evaluate the data. Now, the 1939 census was falsified because when the 37 census came out and showed that the actual figures of population size were much lower than what Stalin was projecting, and documented the effect of the famine, Stalin reacted drastically. As we shall see, demographers were shot and exiled because of the 37 census. But then they said, we need a census. So the census 2 years later, they prepared the falsification to inflate the numbers to be more reflective of what the official population projection was. And when people say that you cannot trust Soviet statistics, we found in the archives of Moscow a detailed description of how the census was falsified. Detailed description, point by point. And one of the key factors was that almost 400,000 records of people in gulags in parts of Russia were transferred to Ukraine. So they were living in Ukraine and not in Russia, in gulags, to hide the prison population in certain areas of Russia. And that's been documented. So we made all those adjustments, and it turns out that the census in Ukraine was inflated by 2.6%, or about 800,000, or more than what should be the actual number. The inflation in rural areas was even higher, 3.4%. Well, as you can see, in Russia, the falsification was much, much more, because there's no need to hide the effect of the famine in Russia, which is much lower than in Ukraine. And this is reflected in the inflation factors that we see in Russia compared to Ukraine. Now, one problem is migration. Fortunately, we have data on urban migration because they had a registration system for urban areas. If you came to a city or left, you had to register in the office. In 1932, everybody was issued registration cards. So we have a fairly good idea about urban migration, so we can estimate. The problem is rural migration. There was no registration system, so there's no database to see what was the movement in rural areas. So we did a painstaking analysis of all the rural migration streams, out and in, that were documented. Like, for example, Kurkuls. Between 30 and 33, about 364,000 Kurkuls were exiled from Ukraine. Political prisoners sent to concentration camp, about 285,000. Forced immigration of peasants, and so on. There were two in-migration streams. One, the resettlement of peasants from Russia and Belarus to Ukraine, 33, 34, about 138,000, although most of them left after a year, by the way. So there was not such a big deal as people make out of it. But once we tabulated all these streams, we put it together, and we get a 4,800,000 negative migration, the people that left rural areas from Ukraine to different parts of the Soviet Union. Or urban areas, like there was a tremendous rural migration in that time period. Cities in Ukraine grew at a tremendous pace, so we had a negative outmigration from rural to urban areas by more than 3 million. So once we have all that, we can show that the fact that data are incomplete and not reliable is a relative factor. In some cases, they were quite good. In some instances, they were quite complete. In other cases, we can try to estimate them to have reasonable approximation of what the situation was. Now, the 37 census is very interesting because, as you can see, the official projection was for the Soviet Union from 147 to 162. The expected were 169 up to 178, between 7 and 16 million different to what the actual census showed, the 37 census. This is what the 37 census showed, and this is what the government was expecting, between 7 and 16 million more. And if you look at Ukraine, actually the total population in 37 was lower than in 26 for the whole country, and for rural areas was a tremendous decrease, although it should increase in because fertility was very high. So this is the impact of the famine that was documented by the census. So the census was declared officially flood, was closed, and there was no access to it until the late 1980s, where people were able to see the figures from the census. And at that time, several demographers, Western demographers, evaluated the census and decided it was actually okay. There was no big problem with these figures. And this, as far as I know, is the only census in the world where demographers were shot. 8 demographers and statisticians were shot, and at least 7 were exiled because they dared to show the truth in the country. And this is the expert that evaluated the census and decided that it was okay. So some misconceptions about the Soviet demographic statistics. One cannot trust the data. A lot of data are good, as good as many countries at that time. The statistical system had good and responsible professionals at all levels. Data were not tampered with or falsified. There's no political motive. That's a misconception. Many people think that just because it was Soviet statistics, it's all full of lies. That's not true, because you imply that they were Superman able to control everything. They were human beings like everybody else. They made mistakes like everybody else. Statistics in the Soviet Union were tempered only if there was a political motive for it. If there's no political movement, they left it alone because it didn't bother them. So, like statistics on birth and death between 26 and 31 are okay. The 26 census is okay. The 37 census is okay. The 39 census was tampered with because there was a political motive. So we have to be careful with these generalizations. Now, another thing is people say, well, a lot of data is missing. True. In 1941, when the German army was approaching Kyiv, was an order to destroy a lot of public records documents. Tremendous amount. Most of the records related to the Holodomor were destroyed in Kyiv. But everything that was collected in Ukraine was sent to Moscow. And everything that was destroyed in Kyiv, we found copies in Moscow. They're all there. We went to the Moscow archives twice, and we found all the missing data in Ukraine in the Moscow archives. No problem there. Now, we need to distinguish between registration records and aggregated records. The individual records of when the registered person died, with name, date, etc., were destroyed depending on the oblast. In some oblasts, they were fairly complete, like 92% in Chernihiv, but in some cases, like in Oblast, only 20% survived. But these are individual records we do not use in our estimations. We use aggregated, tabulated data that were tabulated at the level of the village, the city, sent to the rayon, then to the oblast, then to the country, and then to Moscow. So we're using that data, and that data is complete. We have evidence to that effect. Now, another argument that some people use is that there were orders to falsify the vital statistics. That's true. But the order came in 1934, when the government realized the effect of the famine and how bad the situation was. Then they hit the panic button. And they started putting pressure on the local registration offices to change the data, sabotage, petluriuchi, traders, etc., documents about that. But by that time, the aggregated data was already sitting in Moscow, in Kyiv or Kharkiv. there was no way to tamper with that, already part of the record. So that thing was not affected by this political pressure which came later. Another important factor is that Ukraine created an Institute of Demography in 1918. Was one of the first Institute of Demography in all of Europe, with a first-class set of demographers recognized by all of Europe, members of academies, and they did a tremendous job at collecting the data, analyzing the data, and making sure it was a good quality. And everybody agreed at that time Ukraine had the best statistical system in the whole Soviet Union. No question about that. And these people analyzed the data, and we took advantage of that work in our estimation and adjustment of the different data, because they did the work at that time. But once, the 37 census, actually, the data came to Moscow in late 33, early 34, then there was a pressure on key statisticians, the demographers in Moscow especially, to try to tamper with the data. And many of them resisted. They were professionals that they said, we are doing our job. Kurman, Kaplan, Popov, Kvitkin, Osinski registered political pressure. And what happened? Kraval, Kvitkin, Osinski were shot. In other words, there were a cadre of professionals that had some integrity and sacrificed their life for the integrity of the profession. Here's an example of a memo in the Odessa Oblast to the local biostatistical registration system that, there was sabotage, they are duplicating death registration, reducing birth, because the council in the villages in the head of class enemies, kulak, Petlura henchmen, special deportees, etc. But that was after the basic data was already collected and archived and stored. So the political pressure came later and culminated in 37 census, but the actual data that we need for the estimation was already in place. They couldn't change that, it was too late. Next, the famine affected mainly rural areas. Well, as we see, about 4% of all the Holodomor losses occurred in urban areas. And we see that proportionally, actually, the number of losses was slightly higher in 34 than in 32. What happened? You see, Stalin collectivized the peasants to control the agricultural production. He needed to control the food production to feed the urban areas, to feed the workers in the industrialization effort, to feed the army and export. So when the production of food started going down because of the chaos caused by the collectivization, the resistance, they had to start rationing food in urban areas. People are classified in categories from top to bottom, and the number one got normal amount of food, number two less, number three less, and a certain proportion of the population was not protected at all. Didn't have any rations, no access to food, so they're in a bad situation as the peasants. And when the food production in 32 went really down, they had to cut down the rations and exclude many more people from the program, so that actually the famine in urban area 34 proportionally was slightly higher than in rural areas. And here's an example how demography can eliminate the historical record. These are losses by age for rural areas, and these are losses for urban areas. In rural areas, we started with a high loss of infants, then it goes down, the teenage age, but then it hits bottom at 2024, and then it goes up drastically. In urban areas, we still have much lower but high infant losses, goes down, and it stays constant at a very low level until about 30, 35, then starts going up. Why? These are the working ages. What? Children in schools and working ages, they had some food because Stalin needed people to work in the factories. They were to some degree protected, and only later, when they got older, could not work, etc., then the mortality goes up. While in the rural areas, they took all the food away, and they already had nothing, so they started dying at a very early age. So you see the difference in the age pattern in rural areas and urban areas. Stalin targeted Ukrainians in Ukraine and in parts of Russia, like Kuban. Well, I think it's naive to say when they went to the village looking for so-called hidden or stolen grain, there were labels on each house, Ukrainian, non-Ukrainian. So they only hit the house that had a label Ukrainian. Didn't work that way. Everybody suffered if you lived in Ukraine. The problem is that some suffered more than others. And that's something that has not been studied. These are estimates of losses by nationality. Ukrainian, first place. Polish, second place. German, third. Russian, and Jewish, relative to the population. So there is a differential, and actually at the oblast level, there's a much more bigger variation. Like for Ukrainians, you had as high as 245 per thousand population deaths, losses, compared to 98 in Chernihiv. Or if you take Russians, 149 in Kharkiv and 33 in Kyiv and Chernihiv and so on. These are fresh results. We're just beginning to analyze and try to explain why the differences. But there were differences, but the fact that only Ukrainians were targeted, that's not true. Others died as well, some in quite high numbers, but we still have to figure out what were the factors affecting the differences, and that's something work in progress. The next one is, if you look at the map of Ukraine, common sense tells us the highest losses should be in the grain-growing areas, because that's where the collectivization was, the production that the government took away from the peasants, so that's where should the highest losses be. Actually, it turned out that's completely wrong in the case of Ukraine. These are the growing areas in Ukraine, the southern part. Well, Moldova also was part of Ukraine at that time, but Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk to some degree, while Kyiv, Kharkiv, only southern segments of the oblast had some grain-growing areas, was mainly potato, sugar beet, and other crops. So this is where the famine 21-23 hit. And people are expecting the same for 32-33. Well, once we did our calculation, it turns out that the highest losses are not here, but here. The grain-growing regions had much lower losses than the central northern part of Kyiv and Kharkiv. 23%, 24% versus 14, 13. Then we have some outliers, Chernihiv and Donetsk, very low, and also Vinnytska Oblast here. So the challenge was, why? What happened? We'll get into that in the next section, but here, another common sense fact: losses are directly related to collectivization. The more pressure to collectivize the farmers, the more resistance, the more people are dying because they were punished. Well, we have data on percent collectivization. We have data of losses for the 7 oblasts in Ukraine and the 5 highest regions of Russia with the highest losses. We plotted the correlation, 0. No relationship between level of collectivization and losses from the famine. Another puzzle, why? What happened? If we look only at Ukraine, the same. This is just Ukraine. The Ukraine Oblast, practically 0 correlation. Another argument that's been used: how can you say that Stalin targeted Ukraine while in 1933, when he realized the bad situation, he sent food to help people to survive? And Ukraine had the largest level of food assistance compared to other regions. The food assistance in Ukraine between February and July 33 was 107,000 tons. Northern Caucasus only 88.5, and Lower Volga 15.5. But these are absolute numbers. People forget that the more people you have, usually the higher the indicator. Ukraine had 3 times as more population than Northern Caucasus. If you standardize by rural population size, actually Ukraine came in 2nd place and Northern Caucasus came in 1st place in terms of assistance, food assistance. So Ukraine was not the main benefactor of food assistance in real terms. In absolute, yes, but in real terms per capita was lower compared to Northern Caucasus, for example. Now, the so-called food assistance program came with restrictions that are well documented. Was mainly distributed to collective farms and to people willing and able to work in the next harvest. If you couldn't work, you were not allowed to get that food assistance. You are condemned to death. In some cases, they offer the food to independent farmers, but only if they're willing to join the collective farm as an incentive. Otherwise, die. So the objective of this program was not to prevent people from dying from starvation, but to save the 1933 harvest. Because they realized if more people kept dying, there would nobody to work on the field for the next harvest, and the whole economy would collapse of the Soviet Union. So that was the reason why. And on top of that, most of the food came from reserves in Ukraine. In other words, they would take food from the farmers, put it in storage in Ukraine. People were dying while the storage was full of food. And then the assistance program came from food they took away from the farmers and gave it back to them. So it was only a small portion of this food came from general storage in Moscow, controlled by Moscow. So this business of the food assistance argument is not correct.
Professor Golovina?
Yes.
The support to the North Caucasus and the Lower Volga came from internal reserves within Ukraine or elsewhere?
We have not checked that quite yet. But that's something that needs to be checked. Yes, absolutely right. Finally, all parts of the Soviet Union were affected equally by the famine. That's the argument that the Russian historians use all the time. Well, one of the first things we did, we estimated famine losses by republics in the Soviet Union. The total number of losses for the Soviet Union is about 8.8 million, which amounts to 54 per thousand population. In absolute numbers, Ukraine is in first place, Russia in second, Kazakhstan in third, and the rest is minimal. But as we saw, we need to standardize population size. So if you standardize population size, then Kazakhstan comes in the first place, 224. Ukraine in second place, 133. And Prince-Trovia, which was almost part of Ukraine. And Russia in a very distant 32, 1/4 of the Ukraine level. So, and the other republics, the Central Asia, Transcaucasus, the impact was minimal. So the statement that everybody suffered the same is absolutely incorrect. Now, we should leave Kazakhstan separately because the famine in Kazakhstan is a very different process. It's not comparable to what happened in Ukraine and Russia. So that should be kept separately. Okay. Now, direct losses by oblast in Ukraine. As I said, well, we examined 4 hypotheses trying to explain why the differences in losses in different parts of Ukraine. The first one is so-called historical. The highest losses were expected in the grain-growing regions in the south, and we saw that's not the case. So that hypothesis is not correct. Ukraine can be divided in 3 ecological zones. In the north, the mixed forest or Polyscia. In the center, the forest steppe, and the south, the steppe zone. And the hypothesis is that in the steppe zone, basically, was like almost a desert. They had, the grain fields. Once they took all the food away from people, there was nothing else to survive. There was nothing else left. In the forest steppe zone, a mixture of steppe and forest, so there may be some possibility of going to the forest, find some berries or some weeds, etc. Some people manage to survive a bit better. And the mixed forest Polyscia, which is full of lakes and rivers, very rich vegetation, so people had the chance to survive from the land. So the hypothesis is you should have the highest here, middle here, and the lowest losses here. And the third hypothesis that there was a special policy for the border areas of Ukraine with the West, with Romania and Poland, for security reasons, a special program to give special assistance to people living in the border areas to try to prevent infiltration from the border for security reasons. So people living in the border area in the West should have lower losses than others. And finally, the economic hypothesis, which makes a lot of sense. If I, Mr. Stalin, want to collect a lot of grain, I put most of my support to the areas that produce that grain. So I will provide much more support to the areas that are grain-producing areas and leave the others fend for themselves. So we examine each of these hypotheses, and as we saw, the grain-growing region is here. So the historical hypothesis doesn't make sense. Because it's here, as we saw. The question is what happened in Chernihiv and Donetsk. If we look at the 3 ecological zones, this is the Polyscia, mixed forest, steppe, and steppe. So we're expecting the lowest here, no, the highest here, and the lowest here, some in the middle. Well, the highest is here, not here. So the ecological hypothesis doesn't work either. The border hypothesis does work. These are the regions of the western border that have, we see as we progress to the west, the level of losses goes down. So that the border hypothesis here is supported to some degree, and that's affected the Vinnytsia Oblast. Now, the economic hypothesis makes some sense in the sense that we give more support here, so we lower the losses here, while here we go little or no support, so we expect higher losses here, but that does not take into account, for example, Vinnytsia and Donetsk and Chernihiv. So we came up so far with a mixed explanation. There are three oblasts that have specific contextual characteristics that do not fit in the general model. Vinnytsia has lower losses because of the border effect. So it lowers the average of the whole oblast. Donetsk was the center of the steel production effort of the industrialization area. So Stalin, it was critical for him to make sure the workers had enough food to work and produce what he needed for the Second World War. He was getting ready. So he took care of that oblast. And Chernihiv is the ecological hypothesis, where people could survive on the land. And on top of that, because it had very little grain growing, Stalin was not interested in that area. He didn't put a lot of pressure on them because there was nothing to get from them grain-wise. While here we have Kyiv and Kharkiv with high losses, and Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk with low losses. We exclude Moldova, and that's where the economic hypothesis comes in. This is a priority area. This is not priority area. So we help these people, and we don't help this much. That's what exactly happened. But we need to elaborate on that. We have a paradox when we look at the data. Here we have, in 1932, we already see a differential also, like in 1933. High losses in Kyiv and Kharkiv, and low losses in Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk. So this is 1932. We have low losses here. High level of collectivization, but when it comes to fulfill the quota they were supposed to deliver, the percentage is much lower than here. Well, in the high losses regions, we have much lower collectivization level, but they fulfill the quota almost 100%. Doesn't make sense. In other words, supposedly, these collective farms were supposed to produce much better than here, where a lot of people were not collectivized yet. So we have a thing that doesn't quite make sense, that complicates the picture. And we start looking at other factors related to resistance and repressions. If we look at these two oblasts, we have indicators like how many people left the collective farms when they're allowed to do that, because Stalin gave the order in 1932. Massive people living in the collective farms, while here, very few. The percent of independent farmers was much higher in the higher losses than the lower losses, and these were the people persecuted most by Stalin because they resisted collectivization. They were punished by higher quotas, so the losses are affected much more by the percentage of independent farmers, which is consistent with the high loss. The registered number of terror acts was in general much higher here than here. And fines in kind, where they took away your meat and your potatoes and stuff, again, were much higher here than here. So we have a pattern that's developing. This still needs to be further developed, that there was an extra ingredient in the high losses regions, and that is the political factor of resistance and repression that affected also the level of losses in those regions. This is an area that is emerging from the research, and we still have to work much more, but we have consistent indicators that the political national factor may be part of the whole dynamics of the Holodomor in Ukraine. So here's kind of a summary comparing the high losses and low losses that kind of gives a general picture. Because of lack of time, I will move on. Now, one thing that people have not paid much attention, and that is, of all the losses in 3 years, 90% occurred in 1933. So if you want to see why the difference in losses, you have to zero in 33, but that's where the bulk of the losses. So you need to figure out what happened in 1933. And here we have losses by month, by different oblasts. And we see that the two oblasts with the highest losses, Kyiv and Kharkiv, had a tremendous jump between January and June, July in losses. The others also had a tremendous jump, but not as high as the others. So that in 1933, first of all, we see that in all oblasts, about 90% of all the losses were in 33. But the percent of losses between January and July in 33 for all of Ukraine was 85%. 77, 88. The factor of losses between January and the maximum month was 11 in Kyiv and Kharkiv. In other words, the number of losses increased 11-fold times in 6 months. This is a unique case that I know of any man-made famine, of such a concentration of death in such a small period of time. It hasn't been seen anywhere. So what happened? Well, we know that they took away all the grain, then they went looking for hidden grain, and they ended up taking all the food. So a segment of the population was left without anything, and that's what triggered the tremendous impetus of growth of death in a few months. And the business of the food assistance, if you look at the food assistance by month, by date, this is Dnipropetrovsk and Odessa. And this is Kyiv and Kharkiv. If we standardize the population size, the bulk of the food went to Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk, and very little to Kyiv and Kharkiv. And if you match that with the monthly losses, you will see that, this probably affected the lower rate of increase in these oblasts, while these people, Kyiv and Kharkiv, didn't get anything at the beginning. That's part of the reason why death exploded so much. So here's the documentation, the targeted assistance, food assistance, that played a key role in the dynamics of the growth of the death in the first 6 months of 1933. Okay, I'm going to skip some because of lack of time. So let me just show some results from Russia. These are the losses we estimated by region of Russia. We have Lower Volga, 105, North Caucasus, 97, and then we have kind of the middle, Central Black Earth, Central Volga, Ural, and West Siberia, And then we have a large section of the country with very low losses, very low losses. Now, these are large regions, Lower Volga and Northern Caucasus. We hear about a lot of Kuban Ukrainians. So we try to zero in on that area. Unfortunately, the statistics do not allow us to zero in strictly on Kuban, but we have the Krasnodar Krai, where more than half of the population was Ukrainian. And if we separate the Krasnodar Krai from the Northern Caucasus, the losses jump to 141. And what's surprising, when we separate the German Volga Republic, they have the highest losses of all of Russia, 207, comparable to the highest losses in Ukraine. And the other interesting is, people talk about Saratov. If we separate Saratov Oblast from the Lower Volga Krai, again, Saratov have very high, 132 per thousand. It so happens that Saratov was 70% Russian. So this gives you some idea about the impact of the famine in Russia compared to Ukraine. Ukraine, the whole territory, has very high losses. In Russia, only some key segments of the territory. The others, very low. So it was very focused in that sense. So here's a comparison of Ukraine and Russia. We have 222 and 206 Kyiv, Kharkiv. This is only German Volga is comparable to that level. But then the other highest levels are Saratov, Northern Caucasus, Krasnodar, which are comparable to the middle level in Ukraine. So not only was a geographically much more focused effect, but also the level. There's a big difference between Russia and Ukraine. And this gives you kind of a general picture. If we look at losses for the whole country, the highest category in Russia affected only 4% of the territory, and more than half in Ukraine. Population-wise, it affected 15% in Russia, 46% in Ukraine. And if you go at the lowest level, under 50 per thousand, that affected 96% of the territory in Russia and only 14% in Ukraine, and 85% of population in Russia and 12% in Ukraine. Okay, I'm going to just stop here because I want to leave some time for comments and questions. But number one, we have shown quantitatively that the statement everybody suffered the same is totally false. Number two, we have shown that the effect of the famine was universal in Ukraine and only selective in Russia. But there's one thing that's intriguing, and that is, in Russia, we can say Kuban, Krasnodar, and German Volga, the main factor was nationality, Ukrainian and German. But how do you explain Saratov, which was 70% Russian, and when Stalin closed the borders of Ukraine and Northern Caucasus, 1 month later he closed the border of Lower Volga too. A lot of people are fleeing the region. So something happened in Saratov. It cannot be blamed on the nationality factor. It was mainly rural, Russian. And a lot of people died there as well of starvation. The other thing is that in Russia, all the regions with high losses are grain-growing regions. In Ukraine, it's the opposite. The high losses are not in the grain-growing regions. And that's something we are now puzzling to try to understand, try to explain So basically, to summarize, number one, we have examined carefully a lot of statements that have been assumed as fact and showed that many of them are incorrect. Number two, we underscored the fact that if we want to understand the Holodomor, we need to, number one, look at the subnational dynamic, and number two, compare with what happened in Russia. Only then we will have a much better idea what happened in Ukraine. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Wow. Well, we've been privileged to have an amazingly rich presentation that touched upon many, many issues, and I think showed us through statistics and demography how widely one can understand many other issues of what happened during the Holodomor in Ukraine. And with that, I open up for comments, discussion. Yes, Mariam.
Thank you, Professor Molina, for that incredibly rich presentation.
Thank you.
All the statistics that you put up are incredibly evocative for somebody looking at this from the perspective of a historian. And you pose many puzzles that are based on the data. There's differentials in how many people were affected and these sorts of things. And I'm wondering, I mean, it looks really clear from today's perspective, and it's taken decades to put these numbers together.
Right.
But how would you, I guess it's something that scholars need to think about. How do we reconstruct the statistical knowledge that the party leaders had at various levels at this time? Were they acting on data that was inaccurate? Were they acting on data that they had a good idea of what was going on, so that if we analyze their actions today, then maybe we can say they're acting on false information, or maybe we can analyze their activity by saying, no, they knew everything, and they actually made these decisions which sentenced millions of people to an early death.
Right. Well, based on archive documents, we know that there were two levels. One was kind of the official Communist Party level, where they had a 5-year plan with objectives and projections, including population, and those taken as the gospel, so to speak. And then we had the real situation, which was measured at the ground level by the system. So for some time, people didn't know in Moscow what was happening. But starting in 1932, reports are going almost on a daily basis from Ukraine. People are dying of hunger, cannibalism. People don't want to work. We are losing crop, rotting in the field, etc., etc. And they were directed to Molotov, to Stalin. So the fact that Stalin didn't know cannot be accepted as factual. But the question is, how seriously did it take him? Did he really accept that as facts, or maybe just people resisting the party, the ideology, the plan, etc.? So there was a period where all these things were ignored, all these pleas to lower the quotas because people were dying of hunger were rejected at the beginning by Stalin. But when they realized how serious the situation was, then they had to realize the situation, the reality, and had to act. They saw that if they kept pushing that, they run the risk of destroying the agricultural sector of the whole Soviet Union. They could not do that. So they put a stop. They launched this food assistance program to try to save that. But at the same time, some segments of the population, they kept punishing them to teach them a lesson, as was documented. We need to break the resistance of the peasant. So on the one hand, you had the self-deception at the beginning, then the acceptance of the reality, and a kind of a dual response to the reality. So it's a mixed bag. And as we saw, they put pressure on the professionals to change the figures, and many resisted and paid for the life with it. So, as I said, these were not superhuman people. They made mistakes like everybody else, and eventually they had to recognize the reality and adapt to it.
Yes.
I read in several sources that the famine of the 20s, the one that they usually say the Volga famine, had 5 million official victims from official statistics. I heard that was a Soviet.
Can you speak a bit louder, please?
I read in a bunch of places that the Volga famine in the 20s had 5 million victims. But then I saw a map where it showed that there was a part of a famine that was also in Ukraine. And it showed just those areas. It was opposite, like, so where the famine was in
it was in the south. Yes.
And in the 30s it was in the north. So
Correct.
It's like they switched places. So
Yes, absolutely.
Is that a factor in, like they didn't want to hit the same area twice, or?
Well, the famine in the 20s was caused by weather, drought. No question there. And the other factor was that there was some epidemics much higher than in the 30s. And the third one was that Stalin allowed foreign aid, especially in the Volga region, to help people. Now, the actual number of losses has not been thoroughly estimated yet. And that's a project we're working on right now to make a comparison with 21 and 33. And hopefully we'll have the result early next year.
Martha?
Hi. You mentioned documents found in archives in Moscow that are no longer available in Ukraine. I'm wondering if they're published yet. Have you published them? And have people like Weedcroft engaged with your statistics or your results yet?
Well, number one, we do not publish documents. We leave that to historians.
Have they been
We are
published?
demographers. Well, you have the Perich book.
But specifically these that you said came from Moscow that didn't exist in Ukraine. Have they?
Well, we are archiving them now, making copies, sending one copy to Harvard. Eventually, they may maybe put them online.
I'm sorry, you mentioned specifically the ones detailing how they falsified the census.
Well, we have not published it, but maybe somebody should do that. It's available. It's there. As far as Weedcroft goes, I will not get to that, but as you saw, we made estimates of famine at the rayon level in Ukraine. And we tried to do that in Russia as well, because some people argue that if you look at the border between Ukraine and Russia, the famine was the same level in the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. We want to document that. We went to Moscow. We got mortality records for 1933 for all the regions of Russia except these 3 southern regions. We couldn't find them. We tried, couldn't find them. Now, Weedcroft published a map of mortality by rayon for all of Russia, but he never cited the archive source. He never published the numbers. We wrote to them, if you have the numbers, can you share them? No answer. So we don't know where the data came from. Hopefully he will be in Kyiv next month. We have an international conference. We'll ask him again, have you data to support this map? We'll see what he says.
One of the key elements of claiming that the Holodomor was genocide in Ukraine was the closing of the borders. Was there any demographic evidence of that?
Well, first of all, the concept of genocide is a legal historical concept. I am not a historian or a legal expert. I cannot talk about it as an expert. My personal feeling is that it was genocide, but that's just a personal feeling based on all I know and what I know about genocide means. Now, the closing of the borders was only one factor. There were many others. And as I said, we see that, for example, Ukrainians had the highest loss compared to other nationalities in Ukraine proper. That says something. Exactly what we don't know yet, we have hypotheses. And we see that the logical assumption that the grain-growing region should be mostly affected, or collectivization should be the main cause of losses, the data shows the opposite. And we see the areas of the north where there's a history of resistance going back to 1919 had the strongest impact. Looks like it's telling us something. And we have evidence that Stalin said we have to save Ukraine, we can afford to lose Ukraine, etc. And Petliury, etc. So there's a whole literature that Ukraine was a special focus of interest in this whole thing. And just by the sheer numbers, and especially the tremendous increase in 6 months, to me, that's as strong as you can get about arguing for a genocide, because they left a portion of the population to die literally, and that was by design. And that is one of the arguments of genocide. So I think demography will help the people that argue the genocide to prove their case better.
Okay, I have 3 down. This gentleman in the back, here, and then Valentina. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting, very thoughtful collection. My question is more of a kind of historiographic nature or demographic. You mentioned the fact that during the Soviet times, historians on the Soviet side tended to dispute the assertions that there was actually famine, man-made famine in Ukraine. What would you comment on what is the present state of since the collapse of the Soviet Union? What was the reaction of Russian historians to the statistical findings of your research, or have there been more of acceptance coming to terms with the facts and the evidence that you have presented?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Actually, Russian historians that studied this event document in very detail the effect of the famine in different regions of Russia. The evidence is there. The difference is in the interpretation of those facts. They don't deny there was famine. In some cases, very high level of starvation. Kondrashin writes about that in detail. But when it comes to trying to explain why and the difference with Ukraine, that's where the divergence comes in. Like, they kept making the statement, everybody suffered the same. So we did the estimation for Russia by region, which the Russian demographers did not do. And now we can show them that's not true, what you are claiming. Here are the facts based on your statistics, government statistics. The other thing is that I think there has been a change in the last 2-3 years. That historians that were fairly active, Russian historians, all of a sudden became silent or changed the tune because of the political situation. That's my guess. Like Kondrashin, for a long time, was a very respected historian. Now he's a member of the Duma. He's a politician, not a historian. So he has to be much more careful what he says and writes now than before. There were conferences between Russian and Ukrainian historians, demographers here in Toronto some years ago, and the argument was that Ukraine suffered more for other reasons that the Russians didn't want to admit. Now, what I find interesting from our research, besides the fact that we showed the selective impact of the famine in Russia, the case of Saratov intrigues me tremendously. Here's a fact documented that a mainly Russian region had tremendous levels of losses due to the famine, just like in parts of Ukraine. So maybe we should argue that in some cases there was a genocide in Russia as well, not only in Ukraine. So the bottom line is we still don't know a lot. We still need to try to find out more. We have not been able to find in the Russian literature description what happened in Saratov to document that. We still have not found so far detailed description what happened in Saratov, why so many people died. Well, that's important. So in order to have a dialogue with people, you have to have proven, documented facts that we're gathering so we can have a dialogue. And we'll see once we publish our results what will be the reactions of Russian historians. But at least we'll be able to talk more intelligently and objectively, not just in generalities. So to summarize, serious historians in Russia recognize there was a famine. They don't argue with that. They argue with the fact that it affected everybody more or less the same, and not affected Ukraine more than Russia. But now we have the evidence to support that that's not the case. So now the ball is in their court. Why such a difference? Explain. Have I answered your question?
We'll go to, speaking of just one comment, I think one thing that will be looked at is Saratov's actions during the Russian Civil War has to be thrown.
A lot of resistance there.
To any complex. I think that's the logical thing historians are going to jump to on the question of Saratov. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. I joined off thanks so much your work.
Louder, please.
A bit louder, please.
I'm not a historian, neither I'm a demographer, but I have a guess about Kyiv and Kharkiv region. It seems me that the problem lies in the political, in the policy. Both cities and both oblasts were centers of the political influence of Ukraine. First, Kharkiv was the capital. Kyiv was definitely the intellectual center of Ukraine, and maybe the people who governed these centers and the rayons around these centers were more eager to implement the policy of Stalin.
Well, actually, that's not quite correct, because during the whole year of '32, leaders in Kharkiv kept sending telegrams to Moscow. People are dying. We need help. Send us food. Lower the quotas. These were high official Communist Party, Ukrainian party. And actually, later on, Stalin destroyed a good part of the Ukrainian Communist Party because they were trying to defend Ukraine and its people. So it's not correct to say that they were totally just following Stalin's order. Some paid with their life for that, and many kept saying that, and then Stalin reacted, accusing them of traitors, sabotage, and say we need to get rid of that, and kick them out, put people of his whole confidence from Moscow. So there was a dynamics there that there was a lot of resistance in Ukraine, even at the highest level, because they saw their people dying, and they were trying to help them. There were cases where oblast leaders distributed food to peasants that were dying. Then, when it became known to Moscow, the order came back, take it back from them. And those people were either shot or kicked out of the party because of that. So it's not as straightforward as we think. Part of the problem is that we tend to generalize the Holodomor because of the symbolic reasons, and we need to be more careful because it's not black and white. There's a lot of nuances there.
You mentioned that there's still archival material that have to be studied.
The what?
Archives.
Yes.
Do you feel that they might affect the figures that you have presented today, that they might change the figures?
The demographic figures, no, because we have all the evidence needed, all the data needed to do the demographic estimation. Now, they may affect the explanation of our results. Let me give an example. As I said, we're beginning to suspect that the political factor of resistance and rebellion was much more important than what we thought. And we have, the book by Lynn Viola, professor here, that documented peasant resistance in the 30s, although Russia and in Ukraine, but that was at the national level and only basically a couple of years because no more data. 2-3 years ago, a Ukrainian historian, Krutzik, went through all the oblasts in Ukraine and dug into the archives of all the oblasts of Ukraine. He found a tremendous amount of documentation of peasant resistance all over Ukraine and put them in a database. And we used that database to analyze, to see the correlation between those regions with high resistance and levels of losses. So far, we have no relationship, probably because, number one, there's still not enough data. Number two, we don't know how representative it is. That's an area that still needs a lot of research. The data's there. People have to go and look for it. That may change the explanation, but the actual figures, to our understanding, are fairly solid. Maybe plus minus 10%, but that's about it.
I just wanted to go into what you were just discussing, that this northern and sort of middle area
Yes.
of Kiev and Kharkiv.
Right.
You know, the question that came up to me that's sort of important, because I knew that this was an area of great resistance.
Right.
Is this an area also, you had statistics as to what percentage of ethnic Ukrainians lived in areas. Is this an area that is predominantly more Ukrainian than other areas?
That's correct.
That's what I wanted to know. Because I just came back from Ukraine and where we were discussing other nationalities also suffered.
Yes.
Now, I'm curious to see whether they suffered because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or were they also targeted because of resistance, because they were there? You know what I mean? Because we were discussing that question.
A hypothesis we are elaborating is the one that there was more resistance from them. That's where they were hit harder. But there's another factor we are beginning to examine. Even in rural areas, some people had rations of food. Teachers, healthcare, party officials, bureaucrats that worked in rural areas, they had some kind of a food help, like in the cities. The question is, what proportion of Ukrainians had those positions compared to Russians or other nationalities? That may be a factor. So we need to be careful about jumping into conclusions. We need to evaluate all sides and then to come up with an explanation that we can support using a scholarly logic and data.
So we need a lot more research.
That's right.
Gentleman back there, lady,
just a related question in terms of the work that perhaps you haven't had a chance to look at, but can you talk a little bit about what is known about the famine in Kazakh region?
Oh, there's a good article in the volume.
So what I'd say is, I'll give it to you the answer. The special issue of the journal, which I said just went online, has 2 articles on Kazakhstan. One, a general discussion of the Kazakh famine, and another one, a comparative discussion of Central Asia that deals with both the areas controlled by the Soviet Union and the controlled by China. So they're by the 2 specialists on the Kazakh famine. And with that, but I'll still turn it over to the first speaker.
Well, I have not done research on Kazakhstan, so I cannot talk about it. Sorry.
Yes.
Russian scientists appear to collaborate quite well with respect to things like the space station.
With the what? Oh.
The space station.
Yes.
With the West.
Correct.
Would you say that their demographers are on an equal footing with the West? You, for example?
Well, at the technical level, there has been collaboration. The difference lies in the explanation. That's where ideology comes through. You know, the space station is a fairly neutral topic, so it makes sense to collaborate. But in this case, we are talking about politics, nationalities, imperial independence. It's a fact that even the most liberal democratic Russians have a hard time accepting that Ukraine is not part of Russia. They just have a hard time with it. Although they are Democrats, they believe in freedom, etc., but it's part of the history. And that's something that will take a lot of time to work through. So at one level, we discuss with them, we talk to them, we write to each other, ask them questions, etc., opinions. Fine, no problem. The issue comes when it comes to interpretation. What are the causes? What does it mean? That's where the differences come through. Like Kondrashin came to Kyiv 2 years ago to a conference, presented a paper, and the paper was to try to prove that the losses in Saratov were higher than Ukraine. That was his paper. But actually the methodology was flawed, but that was his paper. So that's where the differences come in.
I think we've come close, unless there's someone who needs to ask a question. Yes, please.
I just have a quick question. I was recently reading that there was another famine after the Second World War.
Yes,
that was
47.
To feed the reindustrialization of the Donbass region.
Yes.
Have you done any research on that, and are there any parallels that you see?
We've done some work on that. We have preliminary figures, but they're still not at the level to be published. But we have done some work. It's a complicated problem because the data, because of the war, has many, many problems.
Correct.
It's much more difficult. No, Second World War.
Okay.
Okay? So this was right after the war. So the data during the war, registration of birth and death, was very poor because of the war. So it's much more difficult to come up with credible figures. But that's something we have worked on, and hopefully we'll finish the project at some point.
But what I think we can say is if we look back to the late 1980s and where we were at that point and the kind of disputes we have, and then look for where we are now, we can see a tremendous growth of our knowledge of it, dealing with many of the other factors and disputes that we have on the famine. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Professor Wolovina and all those demographers, and those demographers who gave up their life, as we heard before, trying to give the evidence as it was. And it certainly opens up many, many new perspectives for research on the Holodomor. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.